Hello and welcome to On Air. I'm Klara Syrewicz. We have entered an era where crime is just another cog in the global economy and state actors are getting in on the game. Today we'll see how they operate and later we'll try to assess the future of NATO. It may be dry January, but so far no one has proclaimed any month as being drug-free with slogans like "Don't get high July," "Methadone March," or "Just say no to a white Christmas this December." In fact, drug consumption has risen, with nearly 1 in 18 people worldwide having used a drug, a 20% increase from a decade earlier. And business is thriving, representing at least 1% of the world economy, or roughly $650 billion in sales and 400 to 500 billion in profits. Unsurprisingly, many state actors feel tempted to join the party. To understand who they are and how the global drug trade is evolving, we consulted an expert on transnational crime.
You come to me and you say, "Don Corleone, explain the drug business." I never respected the drug business.
Well, who does? But it's incredibly profitable, hence the growing sophistication of smuggling and sales. European networks use Narco drones to transport hashish from Morocco to Spain, and in South America, white submarines now shuttle 4 to 10 tons of cocaine at a time, generating up to 8.5 billion in profit while costing next to nothing. The vessels are often discarded after each trip like burner phones.
So wasteful.
Russia has created a drug delivery system worthy of a dystopian Uber Eats. People shop on very large public-facing market platforms, advertising themselves on social media. Customers never even meet their dealers. They pick up the drugs from dead drops like bushes or drain pipes. Smugglers are getting creative too, hiding drugs in everything from bricks to bananas. And yes, a batch of cocaine-stuffed bananas accidentally wound up in a provincial supermarket in Poland 5 years ago.
Making money on wholesome activities, like growing fruit. But if you can't pay the police, if you're sanctioned, if you're waging a war, who will protect you?
When state institutions fail, criminals fill the void, imposing their goals on official priorities, and armed conflict often follows. The Assad family has been involved in the drug trade since the 70s, but by 2022, drugs were the regime's lifeline, generating over 90% of its revenue. Syria became the world's largest narco state, with annual proceeds estimated at $57 billion, about 3 times the total trade of all Mexican cartels. Most production centered on captagon, a substance similar to amphetamine. But rebel groups also relied on drug profits to fund their own state-building efforts. And this raises significant questions about the viability of a new Syrian government and whether it will relinquish this crucial source of income. Meanwhile, going cold turkey can have devastating consequences. The Clinton-era anti-coca campaign in Colombia led to mass suffering and empowered FARC guerrillas, while the Taliban's 2022 ban on opium, which slashed production by 95%, decimated Afghan livelihoods and triggered a humanitarian crisis. Although not entirely dependent on its drug lords, there's another country that enjoys a very cozy relationship, not just with Mr. Captagon, but with organized crime. In Russia, the cross-pollination between administration officials, security services, Wagner mercenaries and criminal groups is practically seamless. As one British security officer with insight into Russian organized crime puts it,
basically, the Russian intelligence community has a perverse advantage precisely because it's so dirty.
Before the war, Russian and Ukrainian gangsters worked hand in hand. Ukraine served as a key conduit for Latin American cartels shipping to Europe and for heroin trafficked from Afghanistan, with Russian mob coordinating many shipments. Some entered Europe through the FSB-controlled Moldovan breakaway region of Transnistria. Once a haven for smugglers, Transnistria's role diminished as Kyiv pushed Moldova closer to the west. which may be another reason why meddling in Moldovan elections and getting access to the Black Sea ports of Odessa or Pivdenie are such important goals for Putin's regime. Indeed, the war shifted everything, with curfews, closed ports, limited shipping options and landmines everywhere. According to a US government report, this created an atmosphere of unacceptable risk for international criminal business. The closure of these routes severely impacted Russian criminal groups, forcing them to redirect heroin through Iran or Belarus, both closely aligned with Russia and likely aware of, if not partaking in, this booming business. The question of whether states control or enable such activities is a major source of contention. An excellent example is the fentanyl-laced debate surrounding tariff wars between the US, China and Mexico, with India and Canada playing supporting roles in the drama. The US is experiencing its most lethal drug epidemic yet, with over 1,500 overdoses every week, most of them from fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. It's largely produced using precursor chemicals from China and shipped to Mexico, or sometimes Canada, where cartels turn them into tablets and smuggle them into the US. India and China have vast, poorly regulated chemical and pharmaceutical industries involved in producing these precursors, many of which are legal and serve multiple purposes, making regulation difficult. China has long refused to cooperate with the US and failed to implement domestic controls, a stance reinforced after Nancy Pelosi's 2022 visit to Taiwan. When China did engage with the US on law enforcement, it sought leverage in other areas which the US didn't really give into, calculating that a shared interest in slowing drug consumption would be sufficiently motivating.
But what does China get out of this? Nothing. If America is bleeding money because it has a fentanyl problem, nothing personal, it's just business. And the Chinese government can make its criminal families an offer they can't refuse. They ship the precursors to Mexico. The government looks the other way. But if they sell to their own people, they get justice.
Growing evidence suggests China is weaponizing this trade. A congressional committee found the Chinese government directly subsidizes precursor production and export through tax rebates. It permits Chinese brokers to openly strike deals with Mexican cartels or sell online, and offers monetary support to companies involved in trafficking. Although China has agreed to resume cooperation with the US, the incoming administration has bigger plans, with Trump vowing to impose new tariffs on China, Mexico and Canada on day one of his presidency to force a crackdown on drug smuggling. But drug traders, like global capitalists, know that survival means scalability. Selfies posted by guests at a lavish 2017 wedding in Dubai drew the DEA's attention. The groom, Daniel King, a top European drug lord, was joined by his Italian, Bosnian and Moroccan counterparts. The DEA and Europol soon discovered that, far from competing, they had formed a supercartel, controlling at least a third of the European cocaine market. For years, they had shipped massive quantities of drugs, buying in bulk through what can only be described as a gigantic crowdsourcing operation.
With fewer players in one market, you can control prices.
Like OPEC, narcos can adjust supply strategically. In 2022, global cocaine production hit a record high of over 2,700 tons, 20% more than the previous year, possibly to counter growing competition from chemical-based drugs and promote demand for traditional narcotics. Even if supply and demand for various drugs fluctuate over time, overdoses don't. According to CDC statistics, US drug overdoses have been growing exponentially since the late 70s, despite state interventions and changing drug trends. Why? It's a complex issue, but Don Corleone has a theory.
I remember the Prohibition era. If the police puts you in prison because you distill liquor or you drink liquor, You ain't gonna make beer, you're gonna make whiskey. And the man who buys it, he's gonna carry a little flask of whiskey, not a pina colada.
There's a hellish rule that economists call the Alkin-Allen effect, or the iron law of prohibition. The stricter the law enforcement, the more potent the drug. As delivery risks rise, producers are incentivized to make stronger, smaller drugs to ease smuggling. This doesn't increase the drug supply, but it does make it deadlier. Like Mexican cartels, Russia's darknet platforms shape the market to their needs rather than demand. Cocaine and heroin have been pushed out and replaced by synthetics like mephedrone, which require short production times, no fixed geography, and only cheap, easily sourced chemicals. They can be made in a garage. There's much speculation as to why these new drug cartels have risen unchecked in Russia. But one possible answer is that they are temporarily useful to the state. Ukrainian authorities report widespread drug use among Russian soldiers who use darknet dead drops or Telegram channels to buy in occupied areas, paying with Russian debit cards. By September 2022, despite shortages in basic necessities like water, mephedrone was available in Mariupol, Kherson, and across the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And then there's the money. Russia's economic struggles require liquidity, prompting many financial institutions to overlook dirty funds. Under Putin's mobilization state, mafias have become a multi-tool, supporting sabotage, cyber attacks, smuggling, illegal financial flows. And the anonymity of cryptocurrency shields state-linked actors, so unsurprisingly, Moscow has been a champion proponent of its use. Perhaps worryingly, an already financially opaque incoming US government and its crypto preachers foretell even less traceable money and more of a headache for law enforcement. And who's cheering then?
Salute.
During his visit to Warsaw on Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the US is a strategic partner for stability in the world, the largest donor of support and most committed to repelling Russian aggression. But will it soon cease to be? Will the US even stay in NATO? Let's take a look at the current state of the transatlantic alliance.
US President-elect Donald Trump has a clear message to all NATO member states. The US itself last year spent 3.38% of GDP on defense. Some countries lag behind more than others. Italy is the only country in this set that actually lowered its figures. And finally, the teacher's pets. These are countries setting the example for the rest of the alliance. Poland leads the way.
Welcome back. We have Bartłomiej Kot with us in this program. Thank you very much for being here.
Lovely to be here with you.
We'll start with Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Warsaw last Wednesday, during which Prime Minister Donald Tusk revealed that Russia had planned terror attacks on various airlines, and the source of this intelligence was actually the US. So what do we know about these attacks, and how should NATO countries react to that news?
With the alleged planned attacks on airlines, this is something huge. Let me be honest with you here, because this is not only something which is like the attack on critical infrastructure, where of course there is a harm even to the civilians. Here we have the example of very pure attack on potentially on health, on life of people who are boarding these planes. We know that Russians, they planned planting some materials, inflammable materials into the civilian airplanes in order to test. There are breaches in security in Europe, and if I'm not mistaken, also in the US.
Apparently, the Biden administration warned the Kremlin not to go ahead with those attacks. But meanwhile, on Tuesday, Donald Trump expressed sympathy for Russia. So there's a bit of a dichotomy here in both administrations' approach.
If you go back to the reaction of Biden, this is quite significant. We know that there are not direct calls or there are not direct meetings between, of course, the presidents of the US and Russia. Biden was very clear in sending a signal directly to the Kremlin that these activities, they go beyond the threshold of what is acceptable. With Trump, it's a bit different. Of course, Trump understands the Russian threat, and I'm certain about that he understands that Russia has destructive potential when it comes to the security of Europe or to the security of the US. But he thinks about dealing with Russia in a completely different way. It makes sense to get in touch with Putin, to make certain dealings with him whenever actually he feels that it will threaten also the US interests. In my opinion, if the same issue was on the desk of President Trump, I suppose he will be also sending the very similar signal.
The security of Europe is being treated by Donald Trump in a very transactional way. He has made US NATO membership sort of conditional on trade relations with Europe, so the blackmail has an economic dimension, not really a security one. So in plain speak, what we in Europe are supposed to buy to make the US stay in NATO.
A good example, look at Elon Musk and Zuckerberg recently. Of course, we have very strict regulations in Europe related to the digital platforms. We have, of course, right now the discussion about whether the European Commission can sue Elon Musk for his activities. And this is actually a huge cost for the providers of these services, like Zuckerberg. So I suppose that if there were any dealings related to trade issues, they will be rather connected to the deregulation aspects, or how to actually allow the American exporters to enter the European market. And this is actually what is probably Trump thinking about when it comes to the future trade discussions. He's trying to win over some territory with the European Union. I do believe that he's right on some points. Having in mind that the idea that the US is paying a lot for European security, and that the Europeans were benefiting from not only cheap security, but also cheap oil and cheap gas for years that they were importing from Russia.
I wouldn't say there was cheap, yes, from Russia, yes, but not from the US. When we were buying gas from the US, that was a very expensive thing.
This is a different story right now, because but this is also an aspect of actually the Americans providing certain security to Europe. In that regard, it is connected, of course, to the energy supply. Of course, this is also business, so they are profiting from that. For years, it was actually the US taxpayer that was paying, of course, for the security of Europe. Of course, that's a plain language, but it is what Trump thinks about this situation. Whereas actually the Europeans were not caring a lot about their security, they were dealing with countries such as Russia, importing gas, importing oil, and actually not providing for their own security. And in that regard, actually, even Prime Minister Tusk, he also had made this
Yes, he said, on one thing we must all agree with President Trump, no one will fix our security problem for us anymore.
And we are here, actually, that's a bit of a cold shower on our head. If it's actually for our side something which will awaken us from this long sleep that continues since the end of the Second World War, not only the Cold War, but I would say that even from 1945, then in my opinion, that's actually a good aspect in all of that.
So you agree with Trump saying that we all should be spending 5% of GDP on defense in Europe?
In my opinion, we should be spending as much as is necessary to have a credible deterrence potential against Russian activities. If that's 5%, that's 5%. If we do not spend 5% right now, we would enter at some point with, the direct confrontation in Russia, and countries such as Germany, such as Poland, would be spending actually 30% of their GDP. The question is, of course, how you spend this money, whether you only buy equipment or whether you also expand your research and development potential, whether that's actually an investment you make into European market or into US market and your own market. I mean, this money can, of course, come on also with some positive solutions. The European economy needs a lot of competitiveness, and we are not having it right now. We are less competitive than the US economy.
If the US wants to have a permanent presence near the Panama Canal, it might have to spend more on its own defense soon as well. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Cheers for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for watching. We return next week with more commentary and unexpected guests. Have a very good weekend.